I found the box on a Tuesday in October, 3 months after my stepmother's funeral, in the bedroom I had not slept in since I was 21 years old. I was there to clear the house before it went on the market. My father had passed 2 years earlier and the estate had taken longer to settle than anyone expected, and now it was finally time to go through what remained. I had been dreading it in the low-level way I dreaded most things connected to that house, a dread that was less like fear and more like the particular tiredness that comes from carrying something heavy for a very long time. The bedroom was mostly empty already. I was checking the closet when I noticed that one of the floorboards near the window sat slightly higher than the others. I pressed it with my foot. It moved. I knelt down and I lifted it, and underneath, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white and was now the color of old paper, was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, sealed with a small brass latch. My name was written on the top in handwriting I recognized immediately, even after 30 years, because it was my father's. Let me take you back to the beginning, because what was inside that box rewrote 12 years of my life, and you need to understand those 12 years before you can understand what the rewriting cost and what it gave back. My name is Elena Marsh, and my mother died when I was 9 years old. Breast cancer, diagnosed in January, gone by August of the same year. The speed of it was part of what made it so hard to absorb, the way the world can change completely in the time it takes a school year to end. My father, whose name was Robert, was a quiet man made quieter by grief, the kind of man who processed loss by retreating so far inside himself that he became almost invisible to anyone watching from the outside. I was 9 and I had lost my mother and my father went somewhere I couldn't follow, and for the 6 months after she died it was just the two of us in the house, moving around each other carefully, two people who loved each other enormously and had no idea how to say so. He met Patricia at a work conference 8 months after my mother's death. I know this now, the timeline, the context, because I have since pieced it together from things other people told me, but at the time I only knew that she began appearing at our house on weekends, first for dinner, then staying later, then present on Sunday mornings when I came downstairs and found her in our kitchen using my mother's coffee maker. She was 41, my father was 44, and she was the kind of woman who wore her confidence like a piece of clothing, always on, always visible, part of how she occupied a room. I did not like her from the beginning, which I have spent years examining to make sure was not simply the reaction of a grieving child who would have disliked anyone who appeared in that role. It was not simply that. There was something in the way she looked at me when my father wasn't watching that was different from the way she looked at me when he was, and I was 9 years old but I was not unobservant. They married 14 months after my mother died. I was not consulted. I was told, the way children in that era were often told things, as information rather than conversation, with the assumption that acceptance would follow in time. I was a bridesmaid at a wedding for a woman I barely knew, in a dress the color of seafoam that Patricia had chosen, and I stood at the front of a small chapel and watched my father marry someone else and I held my face still the way I had learned to hold it since August, when holding it still had become the only way to get through any given hour. Patricia moved into our house the weekend after the wedding. She came with boxes and furniture and opinions about where things should go, and within 3 months the house looked different, not dramatically, but in the accumulated way of small changes that add up to a statement. My mother's reading chair was moved to the garage. The photos on the hallway wall were rearranged so that the ones of my parents together were no longer visible from the front door. The kitchen was reorganized according to a logic I didn't understand and wasn't consulted about, which meant I could no longer find anything without asking, which meant I had to ask Patricia, which I understood even then was not accidental. She was never violent. I want to be precise about this, because the story of what she did is harder to tell than a story with clear cruelties, and I think that is exactly why it worked for as long as it did. She was never loud about it. She operated in the space between what could be proven and what could be felt, and she was very skilled at keeping herself on the right side of that line whenever my father was present. She gave me chores that were disproportionate for my age and framed them as character building. She commented on my appearance, my table manners, my grades, not viciously, but consistently, in a tone that was technically instructive and felt, when received, like the slow accumulation of the message that I was not quite right. She compared me to her niece, who was my age and apparently better at everything in ways that were mentioned often and specifically. She told my father, when I had outbursts or tears or the ordinary emotional responses of a child who had lost her mother and was being raised in a house that no longer felt safe, that I was difficult, that I was dramatic, that I needed firmer handling. And my father, grief-hollowed and conflict-avoidant and entirely in her orbit by then, believed her. Or seemed to. That was the question I spent 20 years unable to answer. The years of my childhood under Patricia's management have a particular texture in my memory, not dark, exactly, but drained of something. The color of them is muted. I spent a lot of time in my bedroom, which was the one space she had limited influence over, reading and drawing and constructing an interior life that was vivid and detailed precisely because the exterior one gave me so little room. I was good at school, not because Patricia encouraged it but because school was somewhere she wasn't, and the praise of teachers felt like proof that I existed in a way that mattered to at least some people. I had friends, careful friendships that I kept separate from my home life because I had learned early that bringing people home meant letting them see the version of me that Patricia had constructed, and I preferred that they knew the other one. My father and I existed in parallel during those years, orbiting each other at a distance that I now understand was maintained by Patricia as deliberately as everything else she managed. She was present for most of our interactions, which meant our conversations were shaped by her presence even when she said nothing. On the rare occasions we were alone, car rides, the occasional errand, something in him shifted, softened, became more like the father I remembered from before. He would ask me about my drawings. He would remember things I had mentioned weeks earlier. He would say my name in a tone that held something in it I couldn't quite name as a child but that I now recognize as love that did not know how to get past the obstacle between them. I did not understand at the time why those moments never lasted, why they never became the norm, why he never chose differently. I internalized the explanation that Patricia offered through implication, that I was the problem. That I was difficult. That his distance was my fault. I left for university at 18 with the particular relief of someone who has been holding their breath for years. I visited home for the first 2 Christmases and then found reasons not to after that, reasons that were honest, distance, cost, the accumulation of a new life, but that were also a choice I was making, consciously, to protect myself. My father and I spoke on the phone occasionally, calls that were warm and slightly careful, as if we were both navigating around something we had agreed not to name. He sent birthday cards every year, always in his handwriting, always with a short personal note inside that said things that made me wonder, if I let myself, whether the man on the phone and the man in those cards was the same man who had stayed silent for 12 years while Patricia managed his daughter out of the house. I didn't let myself wonder too long. It was easier not to. He died 2 years before I found the box. A stroke, quick, the way my mother's death had not been. I flew home for the funeral and stood in a church I had avoided for 15 years and felt grief that was complicated by everything unresolved between us, love and resentment and the loss of the conversation we had never had, the one where I asked him why and he told me the truth. Patricia was at the funeral, diminished in the way that people become when the person they organized their life around is gone. She died 8 months later, her heart, which in retrospect seemed almost too symbolic to be coincidental. The house went to me, the only child, as my father's will had specified. Patricia's own family contested it briefly and then didn't. The estate took 2 years to settle, and then it was October and I was driving back to the town I had grown up in, dreading the house and the memories and the ordinary work of deciding what to keep. I was not expecting the box. I was not expecting anything except the particular exhaustion of closing something that had never been properly open. The brass latch was stiff but not locked. I sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom in the October light and I opened it, and inside was a bundle of envelopes, tied with kitchen twine, the kind my father kept in the drawer next to the stove. There were 23 of them. Each one was addressed to me, at the house, in my father's handwriting. Each one had a date written in the upper left corner where a return address would go. The dates ran from the year I started secondary school to the year I left for university, 12 years. One envelope per year, sometimes two. Every one of them had been opened and resealed, the flap tucked back rather than glued, the way you reseal something you have read and don't intend to send on. I understood what I was holding before I opened the first one. I sat on the floor of that room for a long time before I was ready to read. The letters were not dramatic. That is the first thing I want to tell you, because I think you might expect them to be revelations, accusations, the kind of writing that makes everything suddenly clear and clean. They were not that. They were my father writing to me the way he could not speak to me, carefully and with great effort, the words of a man who knew he was failing someone he loved and could not find a way to stop. In the earliest letters he wrote about missing me, specific and small, the way I laughed at my own jokes, the drawings I left on the kitchen table, the sound of me moving around upstairs when he was trying to sleep. In the middle ones he wrote about Patricia, obliquely, the way people write about things they are ashamed of, references to the house feeling wrong, to wanting things to be different, to the distance between us that he seemed to believe was partly his fault without fully understanding how it had been engineered. In the later ones, the ones from my last years at home, there was something more urgent, something that read like a man trying to say something important across a distance he couldn't close. He wrote, "I know you don't feel at home here. I know some of that is my fault. I am trying to be better. I don't know if you can see it. I hope one day you will let me explain." He never got to explain. I left at 18 and he died at 62, and the conversation we needed to have never happened because Patricia had been intercepting his letters for 12 years and constructing, in the silence they left behind, a version of my father that I believed completely, and that was not the whole truth. I sat in that room for a very long time. I read every letter twice. The light changed outside the window and I didn't move, and I let the full weight of what I was holding settle into me without trying to manage it or redirect it or decide too quickly what it meant. What it meant was this: he had been trying. Not enough, not in the ways that would have actually changed things, not by confronting Patricia or removing her influence or protecting his daughter in the ways a father should. But he had been trying in the only private way available to a man who was conflict avoidant and in love and unable to see clearly what was being done in his house until it was too late to undo it. He had been writing to me for 12 years and I had never known, and he had died believing I had chosen never to reply. I drove home that evening with the box on the passenger seat and I cried for the first time, not for the childhood, which I had grieved in pieces over the years, but for him, for the version of him I had never been allowed to know. The one who wrote careful letters in his neat handwriting and tucked them in envelopes and somehow believed, or needed to believe, that they were reaching me. And I cried for the version of me at 12 and 15 and 17 who had waited, without knowing she was waiting, for her father to show up for her, and who had concluded from his silence that she was not worth showing up for. That girl had been wrong. She had been given wrong information by someone who benefited from her believing it, and she had believed it for 25 years, and she had built her understanding of herself around it in ways I was only beginning to identify. The grief was enormous, and it was also, underneath, a strange and fragile relief. Not because the truth made everything better, it couldn't, there was no version of it that gave me back the 12 years or the father I should have had. But because the story I had been telling myself about those years, the one where my father's silence meant I was not enough, turned out to be a story someone else had written and handed to me, and I had the right, now, to put it down. I have spent the 2 years since that October afternoon doing the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding the narrative of my own life. I started therapy, something I had avoided for years with the particular resistance of someone who has learned to be self-sufficient because dependence felt dangerous. My therapist is a small, precise woman named Dr. Adissa who has a gift for asking the question that dismantles the assumption I didn't know I was making, and who has helped me understand, carefully and over time, the difference between what actually happened and the meaning I was given to attach to it. I have made peace with my father in the way you make peace with someone you cannot speak to anymore, incompletely, imperfectly, in the ongoing and recursive way of grief that doesn't resolve so much as integrate. I understand him better now than I did when he was alive, which is one of the stranger gifts the letters gave me. I understand that he was a man of significant limitations who loved his daughter and failed her and tried in the only small way available to him to maintain a connection he had allowed someone else to sever. I wish he had been more. I wish he had been the father who saw what was happening and put a stop to it and told his daughter clearly that she was loved and safe and home. He was not that father. But he was not the father who chose silence because I wasn't worth his voice. That distinction has taken me 2 years to fully absorb, and I am still absorbing it. I am 36 years old now. I have a small house in a city I chose for myself, a job I find meaningful, friendships I have built slowly and well. I have a daughter of my own, she is 4, her name is Rosa, and she has my mother's eyes in a way that still catches me off guard sometimes when the light is right. I tell her every day that she is loved. I tell her specifically and repeatedly, the way my father told me in letters she will never read, except that I tell her out loud, to her face, in words she can hear and hold and carry with her. I am aware, in the way that parents who have been hurt tend to be aware, of what it costs a child to grow up uncertain of their place. I am determined that she will never have to wonder. Patricia is gone and the house is sold and the box of letters sits on my bookshelf at home, next to a photo of my father that I found in the same room and had framed him at about 40, before the grief, before Patricia, squinting into the sun somewhere I don't recognize, looking like a man who was happy and didn't know yet that things were about to change. I look at it sometimes and I feel something I don't have a single word for, love and anger and sorrow and the particular tenderness you feel for someone who was human in the worst possible way, at the worst possible time, and who tried, inadequately, to leave something behind that told a different story. He did leave something behind. It found me 30 years late, under a floorboard, in the bedroom I had been trying to leave behind for most of my adult life. It came in a box with my name on it in his handwriting. And what it told me, in 23 careful imperfect letters, was the thing I had spent 30 years not knowing how badly I needed to hear. That I had been seen. That I had been loved. That the silence had never been about my worth. Some truths arrive late. They are still true.